Hello, this is Pick, and welcome back to my developer commentary for Integration by Parts DX presented by FTB. In the last episode, we finished most of the main remixes. This is the Ritual Containment Sphere, which is the reward for the Blood remix. While it has several recipes that could be useful, two of note are the one that produce ores, which I'm not making use of because I already have many ways to produce ores, and the way to produce loot bags. This effectively dupes loot bags that you've gotten from the dimensional dungeons. I use that a lot this episode because it gives you Mekanism's upgrades, as well as some other stuff. If you were really missing an enchantment table, now's the time where you can go get one, if you wanted to. Being able to increase the speed and decrease the energy consumption of the Mekanism machines that don't have factories will be very useful. One of today's main projects is going to be extremely expensive as far as nuclear fuel goes, or should I say fissile fuel, so I definitely want to be producing as much of it as I can as fast as I can. Next, I'm going to need some polonium pellets. These are made by putting nuclear waste through the solar neutron activator, and then sending the rest of the polonium through the pressurized reaction chamber with fluorite dust to make polonium pellets. I didn't realize you can't transport polonium through the quantum entangleporter, so you're gonna have to wait a minute for me to fix that later. This large structure is known as the supercritical phase shifter, or SPS. It takes that radioactive polonium gas and converts it into antimatter. I fiddled with the ratio several times in development, and currently in this video it's 500 polonium per antimatter, but it gets changed to 250 by the end. I leave it the way it is, but that's just because I deal with development as it goes along, and whatever I'm currently stuck with is whatever I'm currently stuck with. It's also going to require massive amounts of power to run, and I have something in mind for how I'll be generating it. And now it's time to do Mechanical Remix. I'm gonna get it out of the way because it's the last one for right this minute, and it's gonna be important to have it finished for later. The first step is to produce liquid nitrogen, which is obtained by chilling the air in a bucket in the blast chiller. For the most part, this is actually a relatively simplistic remix, and we've already done most of the things required for it already, but there is still one major step I haven't done. Because it wasn't all that eventful, I ended up just finishing most of this stuff instead already. The main element here is these three advanced chemical reactors. While the chemical infuser does reactions between two gases and produces a product, these produced from two liquid ingredients. This is much faster as it has a higher throughput than those chemical infusers, but you need to convert using the rotary condensator to make it happen. First, the nitrogen is converted into nitrous acid, and then that's converted into nitric acid, which then gets mixed with ethanol to make nitrile etch. This is a strong acid, and it gets strengthened even further in the thermal evaporation plant after you take out most of the excess water diluting it. If you're having issues with the lack of speed upgrades, you can just make more rotary condensators. I know they're a little bit expensive, but it works to have more processing on the line. It's like having a factory but with more machines, and I get that's kinda obvious, but that's how it works. To produce ethanol, I'm just taking potatoes and sending them through an industrial fermenter. It's the easiest way to make it as long as you filter out the poisonous potatoes. It's also already in liquid form if I do it this way, so that means I can send it right into the advanced chemical reactor. By now I'm sure you've seen all too many phytogenic insulator setups. They're just so convenient to use, especially when you can just buy catalyst augments and not have to stock it with phytogrow like ever. Using a blast chiller, I'm making snowballs and the energizing orb charges them. It takes 500,000 RF to charge one, but if you have a high enough tier energizing rod it won't take too long. This all gets sent into a sequential fabricator, which is accepting imports of purple plastic, which is being made outside. If you remember the HDPE setup I had, I just started exporting purple dye into the formulaic assemblicator there. I'm also only making the ultimate circuits in batches, but you'll see why later. With that out of the way, the mechanical remix is now complete. This means that I can finally get the remix generator. This is an insanely powerful generator that takes one of each remix item as fuel. It lasts a pretty long time and it makes quite a lot, so you're not going to be running through it anytime soon. That is, unless you're using the SPS, which is an absolutely huge power glutton. That's kind of exactly what it is though. It's meant to be another option if you don't want to make a Mekanism reactor, because I know making those things over and over gets kinda tiresome like anything else. Before I hook it up though, I want to make a better power storage unit. This is the only way to properly scale just how much energy the remix generator produces. The induction matrix is a massive power storage unit, and it's also modular. You can make it bigger or smaller and include more or less components. You'll need at least one induction provider and one induction cell. One component is in charge of storing the energy, and the other is in charge of how much can get transferred. To actually make use of it though, you're going to need to have a lot of energy wires going into it. I'd recommend using several ports with several wires, but for right now I'm only going to use one. It's just, that's how it is. And I'll be exporting into the Flux network anyway. This is strictly for the SPS. The Flux network is still going to do its job. It's a bit blink and you miss it, but you can see just how fast I'm producing power with this thing. It's absolutely crazy. And it's enough to pretty much support me for the rest of the game, but that's kind of the point. The issue with my little SPS setup here is that, unfortunately, you can't transport radioactive materials using the quantum entangler, and I didn't realize that before. So, it's not something I'm normally going to do, but I am going to move this stuff down here in creative. The only reason I'm doing that is because radioactive materials kind of ruin the area when you break them. It just corrupts the chunk and you get infected with radiation poisoning. And I don't want to have to deal with all that, because remember, it's on the moon, so I already need to have space gear if I don't want to have my healing axe taking care of me, or if I'm in the space station, but you get the point. It's a hassle, and I deal with all the worst ratios for recipes and stuff before I actually implement them. I've dealt with it before, and I'm going to deal with this for the polonium now. So I think I'm permitted to just move some stuff in creative mode to not have to deal with the consequences of my mistake, right? Time to make a system that automatically crafts inert infinity ingots. This requires 8 different ingots, a prosperity in the center, and 7 different colored ingots around it. The first goal is to get 19 blocks worth of the stuff so that I can create a multi-block that uses them. Beyond that, I only need 100 more. This should get its own crafting core set up, so it doesn't interrupt any of the other crafting operations I make on demand. The only one of these ingots that I haven't produced any of is insanium ingots. This requires insanium essence, which means I'm going to have to start auto-crafting insanium essence if I want to make them at any reasonable rate. You get a total of 2 different flux efficiency augments in this game. What they do is they reduce the power consumption to 0 in a machine, as well as make it process super fast. For things like farming, that's actually extremely strong, hence why I'm only using it for stuff like Inferium. You can't use it on every resource crop anyway, so it's not like you can abuse it that much. You can still use it for things if you want, but I'm only going to use it for essence, flax, and stuff of that nature. By putting this stuff into a RF Tools crafter, I can have it repeatedly tier up the different crystals. Now, the crystal I have is enchanted, and I can repair it, but if you leave it in for too long, it will still break, so you do have to be careful. You can see how quickly this thing operates. It's very effective at producing insanium, though I do end up forgetting and lose the crystal, and I had to make another one. The inert infinity ingots need to be injected with infinity fluid. This is made by alloying it in the smeltery from a bunch of component fluids. You'll want to make sure you have large supplies of liquid starlight and life essence, as they're used for both this and a later project. At this point you should be able to make the elemental fluids in UU matter, or antimatter I should say. It's just a matter of melting it down and putting it in there. A regulator upgrade keeps the ratios running properly, and then you could just export it, though you might have to move it to the bottom sometimes to make sure it actually takes it out. Because I'm going to start using antimatter for a lot of other things, I might as well reduce the demand on the ore setup, so I made a mineralis ritual to start producing more ores. This will slowly produce a set list of ores in the area underneath it with the stone. You can automate it by auto-placing stone and auto-breaking it. That wasn't enough though, so I want to make an Orchid as well. This is a botania flower that consumes mana and does basically the same thing as the Mineralis ritual. It's not free like the Mineralis ritual, but it's also much faster, and with the amount of power I'm producing and the Fluxial Converter multi-block, it'll be really easy to just use all the mana it generates. At this point, because I have the digital miner, getting any of these miscellaneous ores I don't have is extremely simple. All you have to do is go and put it in Silk Touch mode if necessary, and have it whitelist mine all the ores you want. I could have set these things up ages ago, but the antimatter setup was holding me off completely fine when I wasn't using antimatter for anything else. The setup is virtually identical to that of the Orchid Ignum that I set up in the previous episode for getting nether quartz and gold. It's not really that difficult when all you have to do is place down stone using constructors and breaking it using destructors. With that squared away, the next thing on the bucket list is Draconian Minget. This is going to be an important crafting ingredient for later use in Draconic Evolution. To get it though, you can't actually process it raw from the ore, or well, you can, but for only a 4 times yield like the other high energy ores. If you want the highest form of output, you can crush it in the crusher to get 12 Draconian dust. Each of those, as previously stated in the first episode, makes 1 manual ingot using mana conversion. However, if you take those manual blocks and put them through the anti-protonic nucleosynthesizer, you can turn them into draconian blocks using 1 millibucket of Mekanism's antimatter. However, we actually need to get the protonic nucleosynthesizer in order to get there, so that requires 1000 millibuckets of antimatter, which is a whole lot of polonium. It's gonna take a while to amass all of the antimatter I need, but there are plenty of other things I can do in the meantime. I should also add that the best place to acquire draconium ore is in the end. Just use the digital miner to whitelist mine it. The first thing to do in Draconic Evolution is set up a fusion crafting setup. This is going to allow for, well, fusion crafting, from Draconic Evolution's version of it anyway. What you do is you plug in all of these crafting injectors along the side, and as long as they're spaced appropriately, they'll act as inputs for the crafting recipe. This recipe is designed to make awakened draconian blocks, and it requires a dragon heart, which can be attained by killing the ender dragon, or by farming it through the boss fight simulator. After a very long while, and I mean like a lot of time, many hours, I finally have enough antimatter to make 1 antimatter pellet in the chemical crystallizer. This allows me to make the anti-protonic nucleosynthesizer, which I can then use to synthesize various things like more draconium. I can also make various upgrades for things. I can take basic control circuits and make them into ultimate control circuits instantly. It's a little bit expensive when you don't have the infrastructure, but I've been greatly increasing that behind the scenes, and when I wasn't doing that I was just building, making the base look better since I have the time. As you can see, I've greatly increased the speed at which I'm producing antimatter. I have 16 EV solar panels running, and that means I get an antimatter about every 6 seconds during the daytime. The nuclear reactors are still running, of course, but the solars are doing most of the work. That means that the scrap boxes aren't as helpful, but it's always good to have them still. I present to you the Alchemy Reactor. I needed awakened draconium to finish making this, and it's definitely going to be a big project. Or at least, it was. So I ended up having to change things in development, and it does make me kind of sad to have done so. This thing sends items through a cycle in 2 loops. In the first loop, extra components are put into the loop around each node, and it'll process the element. You start with hydrogen, of course, and a hydrogen gets added at every step. So it becomes helium, then lithium, then beryllium, then boron, then carbon, etc. And once it completes 1 pass through each of the 7 nodes using some extra input, it could be a fluid, it could be a gas, or an item, or mana. After that loop, you have one that focuses on energy instead. So this means that theoretically you have to manage 2 separate loops of inputs. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out exactly as I wanted it to. You see, what I intended for was that if you had the wrong input in on a loop, it would cause the loop to fail, and you would have to get a nuclear waste and start over. But that didn't really work out. You could use XNet for most of it. I actually got it almost completely working, but the issue in the end was that you can't really take it out of the loop early, because not everything's divisible by 7, and with the limited port availability, there's only so much I could do, so I ended up removing the failure chance, and now you just have to supply it with all the inputs and make sure everything goes around the loop correctly. There are 2 goals when using the Alchemy Reactor. The first is to make infinity fragments, which are generated in each step in increasing quantity the higher the atomic mass. Every increasing loop adds 1 to the total that you're making, except for the last one, which increases it by 3. In the end, you end up with an element, and if you compress 100 of those in a quantum compressor, you can get 100 blocks after blowing that singularity up. It's supposed to be resource generation, and now it's more viable because it's easier, but I do wish I could have made it something special instead of just another machine. One of the components I don't have already is piles of neutrons. By sending nuclear waste through the isotopic centrifuge, I can acquire plutonium. This can then get sent through the PRC with fluorite dust to get plutonium pellets, and that can get pulverized down into a lead ingot and 32 piles of neutrons. It's rather generous, and it allows you to make 32 half loops, so that's a lot of product for just 1 plutonium pellet. Next up is light oil. That can of course be produced in the fractionating still from crude oil. It's something we basically already have, so I just need to sit and wait and let it process. That's the case with some of these things. I mean, part of it is just life essence and liquid starlight again, and I have plenty of that due to the ender tanks. I did expand on the liquid starlight setup again though. Now to make DT fuel. This is a combination of deuterium and tritium. Tritium is made by sending lithium through the solar neutron activators, and that's why I stored up so much of the stuff. Then deuterium is just made by putting a filter module into an electric pump from Mekanism. This allows it to pump heavy water, and that gets electrolytically separated into deuterium and oxygen. The deuterium is just hydrogen with an extra neutron. Then send those through the chemical infuser, and I can just import it using a quantum entangler. To an extent, I've kinda stopped caring about machine aesthetic. There's just so many of them, and I don't really feel like cleaning up the platform, you know? It's not like I can't fly, either. But remember, kids, it's not a lawn base if there's no lawn. If I built something, it's not a lawn base. Lawn bases are the most evil things ever. Don't do lawn bases, kids. Now to set up production of hydrogen. Not the gaseous hydrogen, like this bottled hydrogen. You just have to send a glass bottle and some hydrogen and water through the PRC, and it makes hydrogen and oxygen. Then that's going to be used as that fusion looping stuff that I kind of talked about before. So if you send the inputs through the system, you can see that it's working. It's consuming the life essence and taking those hydrogens and converting them into helium. The first step is a little awkward because it requires 2 hydrogens. I'm not 100% sure on how I want to handle that yet, but you get more infinity fragments than you'll ever need if you just increase the number of loops as you go along. Not every element has something it can be converted into. Some of them don't really have a use and are just used to get to the next stage. But there are a number of them that are useful that are scattered about. On the low end you have things like fluorine and phosphorus to make fluorite and glowstone dust. In the middle you have things like iron and copper and tin, your metals. And then on the higher end you have stuff like uranium and even polonium to allow you to just produce polonium pellets without all of that mess. A thing of note is that for the mana step you only need 1 potency burst worth of mana, that's 320 mana, to have the step progress. Originally that was because, you know, 1 redstone pulls to have the thing keep going in the loop, blah blah blah. But yeah, that just didn't work out. While there are still some hiccups that I haven't really fixed, it's fun to watch all the items sift through the pipes. This is due to the pipe pressurizer, which is a machine that effectively makes your pretty pipes go as fast as possible. All of the item transport is automatically sent at what is the equivalent of a 3-speed upgrade, and that makes everything reach its destination as fast as possible. Though I'm just using the network I already have in place, I could have used item routing nodes. I should probably, but I already set this up and I don't feel like taking it down. It's not that hard to do. However, to move forward, I'm going to need the quantum compressor, and that requires fighting a Chaos Guardian. I'll be taking care of that in the next episode though. So, with that, I'm approaching the final stages of this mod pack. I'll probably be finished within the next few episodes. Depends on how I divide them, I have yet to see. So, this is Pig. I'm glad to have seen you, and I hope to see you again.